Picture it, a queen draped in shimmering robes of gold, reclining on a throne of ivory, while the fate of empires hangs in the balance. Her name, whispered in Roman halls with both lust and hatred, was Cleopatra. She is remembered as a temptress, a femme fatale who lured two of Rome's greatest men to their doom. But she was also a genius, fluent in many languages, cunning in politics, and ruthless in ambition. Was she a patriot defending Egypt's independence, or a manipulator who used sex as her weapon? More than 2,000 years after her death, her legend is still tangled in scandal, propaganda, and mystery. This is the story of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the queen who defied Rome, and one of history's most controversial rulers. Cleopatra VII, Philopater, was born in the winter of 69 BC, into the glittering, chaotic heart of the Hellenistic world, the city of Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great himself, this was no ordinary capital. It was a metropolis of marble and mines, a beacon of civilization on the coast of the Mediterranean. Its legendary lighthouse, the Pharos, was one of the wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships laden with goods and scholars into its bustling harbor. Its great library and the adjoining museum were the planet's epicenter of knowledge, a place where the greatest thinkers of the age came to study, debate, and write the future. But make no mistake, for the child born within the palace walls, this glittering city was a gilded cage, and hers was no childhood of fairy tales. The dynasty she was born into, the Ptolemies, were the inheritors of Alexander's legacy, but their history was written in blood, not just ink. For nearly 3 centuries they had ruled Egypt not as Egyptians but as Greek conquerors, a foreign elite in a land of ancient traditions. They were descended from Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, who seized control of Egypt after the great conqueror's death. While they presented themselves as pharaohs to the Egyptian people, adopting the crowns and titles, in the corridors of their palace, they spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and lived by a code of Hellenistic power politics. This code was notoriously brutal. The Ptolemies married their own siblings, a practice they justified by pointing to the Egyptian gods Isis and Osiris, but which served a more pragmatic purpose: to keep power and wealth consolidated within the immediate family. This insular focus bred a culture of extreme paranoia and ambition. They killed anyone who stood in their way. Brothers killed brothers for the throne. Sisters poisoned sisters over influence. Parents did not hesitate to execute their own children to secure their reign. This was the family business, and business was bloody. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by poison, both metaphorical and literal. The air in the Ptolemaic court was thick with suspicion, whispered plots, and shifting allegiances. It was said that you never sipped wine without wondering if it would be your last, a fear grounded in a grim reality. She was a direct witness to this brutality. Her own father, Ptolemy the Pointh, nicknamed Auletes or the flute player for his decadent artistic pursuits, was a weak and unpopular ruler. He bled Egypt dry to pay off enormous bribes to Rome, the rising superpower in the West, just to keep his throne. When the long-suffering Alexandrians finally revolted and drove him into exile, Cleopatra, then just a young girl, saw her older sister Berenice IV seize the throne. But power was fleeting. Her father eventually returned, backed by Roman legions, and his vengeance was swift and terrible. He had his own daughter, the ruling queen Berenice, publicly executed. Cleopatra learned a vital lesson from the shadows of the palace. Power was not given, it was taken, and holding it required a will of iron. And yet, in this viper's nest, Cleopatra thrived. She was not like her indolent relatives, content with decadence and courtly games. While her father played the flute for Roman dignitaries, Cleopatra studied. While her siblings plotted for position, she trained, she prepared. She understood that the world was changing, that the old ways of her dynasty were failing. The future of Egypt depended not just on the strength of its armies, but on the sharpness of its leader's mind. Her intellect became her primary weapon. Most royals of her dynasty after 250 years in Egypt spoke only Greek, a deliberate separation from the people they ruled. But Cleopatra was different. She dedicated herself to learning Egyptian, becoming the first Ptolemy to do so in centuries. This was a revolutionary act of political genius. It allowed her to speak directly to her subjects, to communicate with the powerful Egyptian priesthood, and to understand the soul of the nation she intended to lead. But she didn't stop there. Her intellectual appetite was voracious. She studied Latin, the language of the Roman power brokers who had propped up and then executed members of her own family. She learned Hebrew and Aramaic, connecting her to the diverse populations of the Near East. Ancient writers like Plutarch claimed she spoke as many as 9 languages, including those of the Ethiopians, Arabs, and other neighboring peoples. For Cleopatra, every language was a key to a different door of diplomacy and influence. Her formal education, conducted by the finest tutors at the museum, was steeped in philosophy, mathematics, politics, and science. She read Homer's epics, debated the works of Plato, and immersed herself in ancient Egyptian religious texts. The great library was her playground and her training ground. She was as comfortable discussing the complexities of medicine and pharmacology, a useful skill in a court rife with poison, as she was debating the finer points of statecraft and military strategy. She wasn't just a student, she was an active participant in the intellectual life of her city, often engaging with scholars in spirited discussions. Even as a child, she stood apart. She was not merely a princess waiting for a political marriage, she was a strategist in the making, observing the fatal mistakes of her father and sister. She saw how her father's reliance on Rome had turned him into a puppet, and she learned that true power could not be bought. It had to be commanded. Brilliance alone, however, was not enough to survive the brutal world of the Ptolemies. In a family where the path to the throne was paved with the bodies of relatives, one needed more than intelligence. One needed a capacity for absolute ruthlessness. As she watched the deadly game of power play out around her, the young princess was learning, calculating, and waiting. The chaos of her birth had not broken her, it had forged her, and Cleopatra would soon prove that she had learned her family's most brutal lessons all too well, possessing a ruthlessness that would shock even them. In 51 BC, Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, died. He left the throne to his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. Together, they would rule as co-monarchs. But in truth, Egypt was a nation in decline. Its treasury was drained, its influence weakened. The Romans, powerful, greedy, and ruthless, had their claws deep in Egyptian affairs, and Cleopatra's brother, little more than a puppet for scheming advisors, soon turned against her. At just 18, Cleopatra was driven from Alexandria, forced into exile. But Cleopatra was not the type to fade quietly into the shadows. She raised an army in Syria and prepared to take back her throne. And then, fate delivered her a powerful ally. Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the most powerful man in Rome, arrived in Alexandria. He came to settle a dynastic dispute, but Cleopatra saw something greater, an opportunity. The year is 48 BC. Alexandria, the glittering jewel of the Mediterranean, is a city on a knife's edge. A brutal civil war rages between the young queen Cleopatra and her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Into this cauldron of intrigue sails Gaius Julius Caesar, fresh from his victory over his rival Pompey. Caesar isn't here as a conqueror, but as an arbiter and a debt collector. The Ptolemaic dynasty owes Rome a fortune, and Caesar intends to collect. But he quickly finds himself a virtual prisoner in the royal palace, caught in the middle of the sibling power struggle. Ptolemy's court, manipulated by the eunuch Pothinus, controls access to the Roman general. Cleopatra, exiled from her own city, is locked out, her cause seemingly lost. How could she possibly plead her case to the one man who could restore her to power? She needed a plan that was not just clever but breathtakingly audacious. The story has become the stuff of legend, a testament to her daring. Unable to enter the palace as a queen, she would enter as cargo. Cleopatra had her loyal servant, Apollodorus, wrap her in a humble bedsack, or, as the more romantic accounts claim, a priceless oriental carpet. He then slung the bundle over his shoulder, and under the cover of dusk, carried his precious cargo right past her brother's guards. They saw only a servant carrying bedding for the visiting Roman. They had no idea they were waving through the single greatest threat to their authority. Inside Caesar's private chambers, Apollodorus unceremoniously dropped his bundle and unrolled it. Out spilled not a frightened girl or a desperate supplicant, but a queen. At 21 years old, Cleopatra was in her prime. She rose to her feet, a living embodiment of royal authority, having bypassed an army and a royal court to appear before the most powerful man in the world. The sheer theatricality and courage of the act immediately captured Caesar's attention. This was no ordinary monarch. Over the hours that followed, Cleopatra dazzled the 52-year-old Roman. Roman propaganda would later paint her as a bewitching seductress, who won him over with beauty alone. But the truth was far more compelling. Cleopatra was a formidable intellectual, educated at the Great Museum of Alexandria. She spoke as many as 9 languages, and was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries to bother learning the Egyptian language of her own subjects. She met Caesar not as a lover, but as an equal. She spoke of philosophy, politics, and strategy. She understood his ambitions, flattered his ego, and most importantly, she made a powerful case. She, not her feckless brother, would be the more stable, reliable, and profitable partner for Rome. She promised him loyalty, and more critically, access to Egypt's legendary wealth, the grain needed to feed Rome's restless population. Caesar, a man who appreciated audacity and intelligence as much as power, was utterly captivated. That night, a political alliance was forged, and it quickly deepened into a personal one. Soon she was more than an ally. She was Caesar's lover. When Ptolemy's court discovered Cleopatra with Caesar the next morning, their fury ignited the city. The brief diplomatic mission erupted into the brutal Alexandrian War. Caesar and his small contingent of troops were besieged in the royal quarter for months, vastly outnumbered by Ptolemy's army. The fighting was desperate. At one point, Caesar set fire to the enemy ships in the harbor, and the blaze tragically spread, damaging the legendary library of Alexandria. But with the arrival of Roman reinforcements, the tide turned. Ptolemy's forces were crushed at the Battle of the Nile. In the chaotic retreat, the young king, weighed down by his golden armor, tried to flee across the river. His boat capsized and he drowned. Just like that, Cleopatra's rival was gone, swallowed by the sacred river of his own kingdom. Cleopatra emerged victorious, queen once more, now firmly tied to the greatest power in the world. Her throne was secured by Roman swords and her future was intertwined with Caesar's. And soon, that bond was made flesh. In 47 BC she bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy V, known to the world by his nickname Caesarion or Little Caesar. This was a move of staggering political significance. To the people of Egypt, the boy was a divine heir, the child of their queen and a man revered as a living god. He was the future of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a pharaoh with the blood of Rome in his veins. But in Rome, the birth of Caesarion was not a celebration, it was a scandal that morphed into a political crisis. Caesar was already married to a respectable Roman noblewoman, Calpurnia. His flagrant affair with a foreign barbarian queen was an affront to every Roman tradition. The outrage intensified when in 46 BC, Caesar invited Cleopatra and their infant son to Rome. She didn't come as a captive but as a visiting head of state, living openly in Caesar's luxurious villa. To the horror of the conservative elite, Caesar even placed a golden statue of Cleopatra, depicted as the goddess Isis, inside his newly built temple of Venus Genetrix. For senators like Cicero, this was the ultimate sacrilege. They saw her as a corrupting influence, whispering monarchical ambitions into Caesar's ear. Romans whispered of witchcraft and oriental decadence. They feared Caesar, already named dictator for life, planned to discard the republic, declare himself king, and move the capital of the world from the Tiber to the Nile, with Cleopatra as his queen, and Caesarion as his heir. Cleopatra was likely unconcerned by the gossip of a city she viewed as provincial. She was holding court, playing the game of power at the highest possible level. She had bet everything on Caesar's ability to reshape the Roman world and secure a future for their son. And for a time, it seemed her bet would pay off. But fate is fickle, and the foundations of power are built on sand. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, the fears she embodied became the justification for murder. Julius Caesar was assassinated by a conspiracy of senators who claimed to be saving the republic from tyranny. In an instant, Cleopatra's world shattered. Her protector, her partner, and the father of her child was dead. His will was read, and it named his grandnephew Octavian as his heir, not Caesarion. Suddenly Cleopatra was no longer an honored guest in Rome. She was a foreign liability, the mother of a child who represented a threat to the new order. With her Roman shield gone, she and her young son were dangerously exposed. She had no choice but to flee, gathering her son and her retinue and racing back to the relative safety of Egypt. For the second time in her young life, everything she had fought for, everything she had built, was in jeopardy. Her greatest gamble had failed, and now she was alone. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra ruled not only as a queen, but as a goddess. She styled herself as the living embodiment of Isis, the mother goddess of Egypt. Her people adored her. Unlike her predecessors, Cleopatra did not distance herself from Egyptian culture. She embraced it, she dressed in Egyptian regalia, performed sacred rituals, and spoke directly to her subjects in their own tongue. She was not just a figurehead, she was an administrator, a reformer, a strategist. She stabilized the currency, reopened trade routes, and managed Egypt's vast agricultural wealth. She cultivated alliances with neighboring kingdoms, making Egypt indispensable in the politics of the Mediterranean. Under her, Alexandria became a center of learning once again, its library and scholars flourishing under royal patronage. But Cleopatra was also realistic. Egypt's independence hung by a thread. Rome was fractured in civil war, and only by choosing the right allies could Egypt survive. And soon another Roman general would enter her orbit, a man of power, ambition, and passion, Marcus Antonius, better known to history as Mark Antony. In 41 BCE, the Roman world was balanced on a knife's edge, ruled by a triumvirate of powerful men. In the east, Mark Antony, a brilliant general and one of Caesar's most loyal lieutenants, held sway. From his headquarters in Tarsus in modern-day Turkey, he was planning a monumental invasion of Parthia, a campaign he hoped would secure his legacy. But wars are expensive, and Antony needed resources. He also needed to secure his flank. To that end, he summoned the queen of the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean, Cleopatra of Egypt. She was to answer for her alleged support of Antony's enemies in Rome's recent civil war. It was meant to be an interrogation, a display of Roman authority over a client queen. But Cleopatra was no mere client queen. She understood power, and she knew that a first impression could define a relationship. Instead of arriving as a nervous supplicant, she orchestrated one of the most spectacular entrances in history. She sailed up the Cydnus River not in a warship, but in a magnificent golden barge. Its purple sails, the color of royalty, billowed in the wind, while silver oars beat time to the music of flutes and lyres. The air for miles around was thick with the scent of exotic perfumes and incense, a deliberate assault on the senses designed to announce the arrival of not just a monarch, but a living deity. On the deck, under a canopy woven with gold, Cleopatra herself reclined, dressed in the guise of Venus, the Roman goddess of love, or Aphrodite to her Greek subjects. Her attendants were costumed as sea nymphs and graces, while young boys dressed as winged cupids fanned her. The entire city of Tarsus emptied out to witness the spectacle, leaving Antony sitting alone in the public square where he had intended to receive her. The message was clear. If the Roman general wanted to meet the Queen of Egypt, he would have to come to her. Antony, a man known for his love of spectacle and grand gestures, was utterly enchanted. He was a veteran commander, a man of the people, but also a man of immense appetites for pleasure and power. He had expected a provincial monarch, instead he was confronted by a goddess. The planned interrogation was forgotten. Regaining his composure, Antony sent an invitation for her to dine with him. Cleopatra, continuing her masterful power play, declined. She insisted that it would be more fitting for him to be her guest. That night Antony and his officers boarded her barge and were treated to a feast of such splendor it beggared belief. The ship was illuminated by so many lights, arranged in intricate patterns, that it dazzled the eye. The food, the wine, the golden plates and jeweled goblets, it was a display of wealth so profound it made Roman luxuries seem provincial. Antony was impressed, admitting he had never seen anything like it. Their connection was immediate, but it was more than just physical attraction. Cleopatra was not only beautiful but also famously intelligent and charismatic, fluent in multiple languages. She could converse with Antony on any subject, from military strategy to philosophy. For Antony, this was a meeting of equals. Their affair became the talk of the ancient world, passionate, public, and profoundly political. Their needs were perfectly matched. Antony required the vast wealth of Egypt, its gold, and more importantly its grain, to pay his legions and launch his long-awaited Parthian war. Cleopatra, for her part, needed the protection of Rome's most powerful general. Her position as pharaoh was not entirely secure, and she was determined to preserve her dynasty and secure the future of her son Caesarion, whose father was none other than Julius Caesar. An alliance with Antony, Caesar's successor in the east, was the surest way to guarantee both, and so, they forged an alliance built on mutual need and sealed by genuine affection. Whether it was true love, political calculation, or a potent mix of both, their fates were now intertwined. Antony followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria for the winter of 40 BCE, and there they lived a life of legendary indulgence. They founded a dining society they called the Inimitable Livers, holding nightly feasts and competitions in extravagance. They would wander the city streets in disguise, playing pranks on the citizens. It was a world away from the rigid, conservative society of Rome. Alexandria was a vibrant, multicultural metropolis, a center of learning and pleasure. For Antony, it was intoxicating. Their union produced 3 children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. But while Antony reveled in Alexandria, his rival in Rome was watching, waiting, and plotting. Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son and legal heir, was everything Antony was not: cold, patient, and ruthlessly pragmatic. He saw Antony's affair not as a romance, but as a political weapon of immense power. Octavian launched one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in history. He skillfully painted Antony as a man who had lost his Roman identity, a great general who had been emasculated and enslaved by a foreign sorceress. He was no longer a true Roman, but the drunken plaything of the Egyptian queen. Cleopatra was cast as the villain, a decadent, power-hungry seductress who used witchcraft and sex to corrupt one of Rome's greatest sons. Octavian's message to the Senate and people of Rome was simple. Cleopatra planned to move the capital of the Roman world to Alexandria and rule over them all, with Antony as her consort. The propaganda was vicious and relentless. In a masterstroke of political theater, Octavian illegally seized Antony's will from the sacred temple of Vesta and read its contents to the Senate. The will reportedly confirmed Romans' worst fears. It recognized Caesarion as Caesar's true son and heir, left vast Roman territories to his children by Cleopatra, and most damningly, directed that Antony's body be buried beside Cleopatra's in Alexandria. To the Roman public, this was proof of his ultimate betrayal. Antony, seemingly oblivious to the political firestorm brewing in Rome, played directly into Octavian's hands. In 34 BCE, after a moderately successful military campaign, he staged a bizarre triumphal parade through the streets of Alexandria, not Rome. This was followed by a grand public ceremony that would become known as the Donations of Alexandria. Before the assembled crowds, Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones. He proclaimed her Queen of Kings, and her son Caesarion King of Kings and the true heir of Julius Caesar. He then proceeded to donate huge swaths of the Roman East, including Cyprus, Libya, and Armenia, to Cleopatra and their 3 children. From Antony's perspective, he was simply organizing his territories under a trusted and powerful ally. But to the Romans, hearing the news, it was an act of unparalleled arrogance and treason. He was giving away parts of their empire to his foreign mistress and their illegitimate children. This was the final justification Octavian needed. He now had the political capital to act. In a brilliant move, he convinced the Senate to officially declare war, not on the Roman Antony, which would have triggered another civil war, but on the foreign queen Cleopatra. Antony, by standing with her, would brand himself an enemy of the state. The lines were drawn. It was no longer just a feud between 2 men. It was a clash of worlds. Octavian's Rome against Cleopatra's Alexandria. The traditional austere West against the opulent monarchical East. The stage was set for a final cataclysmic showdown at Actium, a naval battle that would not only decide the fate of Antony and Cleopatra, but the very future of the Roman Empire. In 31 BC, the 2 sides clashed at the Battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a massive fleet. Octavian, though outnumbered, had the cunning Admiral Agrippa. The battle raged, ships burned, the sea turned red with blood, and then, in a shocking moment, Cleopatra's ships broke away, retreating from the fight. Antony followed her. Their fleet collapsed. Rome saw it as betrayal, cowardice, or manipulation. But perhaps Cleopatra was thinking strategically, preserving her forces for another fight. It didn't matter. The battle was lost. Octavian had won. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, their empire crumbling around them. Their allies deserted them. Their power dissolved. But Cleopatra was not finished. She attempted negotiations, even seducing Octavian himself. She offered him wealth, loyalty, even herself, if he would spare her children. But Octavian was cold. He wanted only one thing: her death. When Antony heard false news that Cleopatra was dead, he fell on his sword. Mortally wounded, he was carried to her chamber where he died in her arms. Cleopatra, now alone, faced a choice: to be paraded through Rome as a prisoner in Octavian's triumph, or to choose her own fate. She chose death. The story says she pressed a poisonous asp to her breast. Others say she drank poison, or used a poisoned hairpin. Some whisper that Octavian had her killed. Whatever the truth, Cleopatra died at just 39 years old. With her died the Ptolemaic dynasty. Egypt became a Roman province, but Cleopatra herself became immortal, not as a corpse in a tomb, but as a legend. Rome tried to destroy her reputation. Octavian and his allies spread stories of witchcraft, seduction, and depravity. They painted her as a woman who used sex to destroy great men, and yet, Egypt remembered her differently, as a goddess, as a patriot, as a ruler who defended her people against impossible odds. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Cleopatra was cunning, ambitious, and ruthless. She was also brilliant, charismatic, and visionary. She spoke to the people in their own language. She brought prosperity to Egypt, she matched wits with Rome's greatest leaders, and for a time, she won. But above all, she was a survivor in a world that wanted her dead from the start. Her story has been retold for 2,000 years. In plays, in films, in legends. Sometimes as a seductress, sometimes as a patriot, always as a queen. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. The scandalous queen who defied Rome. The woman who made the world tremble. Cleopatra, Queen of Kings.